For 2 years, the same scene had been playing out on Maple Street. 7:30 a.m. Margaret starts watering her lawn. 7:31 a.m. Tommy spots her through the window. 7:32 a.m. Tommy runs inside crying. The neighborhood had grown accustomed to this bizarre routine. Margaret could never understand why the child was so terrified of her, until the day FBI agents knocked on Margaret's door. Tommy's family had finally found the person they'd been hunting for 15 years. But let's go back to the beginning. Maple Street in Cedar Hills, Ohio, was the kind of neighborhood where American dreams came to life in identical two-story homes with white picket fences and manicured lawns. Every morning at exactly 7:30 a.m., Margaret Wilson would emerge from 1247 Maple Street carrying her green garden hose, dressed in her practical clothes and comfortable walking shoes. Margaret was 58 years old, with graying brown hair always pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. To her neighbors, she was the perfect resident, quiet, tidy, and helpful when needed. She had moved to Cedar Hills 3 years ago, paying cash for her house and telling neighbors she was a retired teacher from back east who wanted a peaceful place to spend her golden years. Her daily routine was clockwork precision. Every morning, water the front lawn. Every afternoon, tend to her garden. Every evening, a quiet walk around the neighborhood. She attended the local Methodist church, volunteered at the library, and brought homemade cookies to new neighbors. Margaret Wilson was everything suburban America valued in a neighbor. But at 7:31 a.m. every morning, her peaceful routine was shattered by the same disturbing event. Tommy Rodriguez, the 7-year-old boy who lived next door at 1249 Maple Street, would spot Margaret through his bedroom window and immediately begin screaming. Not crying, screaming, as if he had seen something that terrified him to his core. He would run to his parents' room, sobbing and shaking, refusing to explain what was wrong. This had been happening for exactly 2 years, ever since the Rodriguez family had moved in next door. At first, Margaret thought it might be a phase. Some children were afraid of strangers. But as months passed and Tommy's terror never diminished, Margaret began to worry that something was seriously wrong. Maria and Carlos Rodriguez were loving parents who had moved to Cedar Hills to give their son a safe, stable childhood. Carlos worked as an auto mechanic, and Maria was a part-time nurse at the local clinic. They were hard-working people who had saved for years to afford a house in this peaceful neighborhood. Tommy had always been a cheerful, outgoing child, but his reaction to Margaret Wilson baffled and concerned them. Every morning they would hear their son's terrified screams from his bedroom, followed by his frantic dash to their room where he would cling to his mother, trembling and crying. "Mijo, what's wrong?" Maria would ask, but Tommy could never explain. He would just point toward the window and say, "The lady with the water. She scares me." Maria and Carlos had tried everything. They moved Tommy to a different bedroom. They installed new curtains so he couldn't see outside. They even considered asking Margaret to water her lawn at a different time. But nothing helped. The child's terror was deep and inexplicable. Dr. Sarah Chen, Tommy's pediatrician, suggested that the boy might be experiencing some form of traumatic response, but she couldn't identify the cause. Tommy was too young to articulate his feelings, and there was no obvious explanation for his fear of a harmless neighbor doing normal yard work. The situation became so distressing that Maria and Carlos considered moving. But they had invested everything they had in this house. They were trapped in a situation that made no sense to anyone. As word spread through the neighborhood about Tommy's strange reaction to Margaret, other residents began to look at her differently. While no one could explain the child's behavior, some neighbors started to wonder if there was something they didn't know about their quiet neighbor. Mrs. Patterson from across the street began watching Margaret's house more closely. Mr. Chen from 2 doors down started asking subtle questions about Margaret's background. The neighborhood book club that Margaret had joined became less welcoming, and invitations to community events stopped coming. Margaret felt the shift in how people treated her, but she couldn't understand it. She had done nothing wrong. She was the same person she had always been, quiet, helpful, and kind. But a child's inexplicable fear was turning her into a social pariah. She tried reaching out to the Rodriguez family multiple times. She baked cookies for Tommy, left friendly notes, and even offered to change her lawn watering schedule. But Maria and Carlos were polite but distant, clearly uncomfortable with any interaction between Margaret and their son. The isolation was particularly painful for Margaret because she genuinely cared about children. She had spent her adult life working with young people, and the idea that her presence was causing a child distress was heartbreaking. But she didn't know what else to do. What Margaret didn't know was that the Rodriguez family had a secret of their own. Maria Rodriguez wasn't just a part-time nurse. She was also the sister of Detective Luis Santos of the Cleveland Police Department, who had been working on a 15-year-old cold case that had haunted him throughout his career. In 2009, Detective Santos had been a young officer investigating the disappearance of 3 families from the Cleveland area. The families, the Hendersons, the Garcias, and the Patels, had all vanished within a 6-month period, leaving behind houses with meals still on tables, cars in driveways, and no explanation for their sudden departure. The only connection between the families was that they had all been involved in a federal witness protection program. Each family had been relocated to Cleveland after providing testimony in various criminal cases. Each family had been given new identities and the promise of federal protection. And each family had simply vanished. The FBI had taken over the investigation, but leads went cold quickly. There was no evidence of foul play, no ransom demands, no bodies discovered. It was as if 15 people, including 6 children, had simply ceased to exist. Detective Santos had never forgotten the case, particularly because one of the missing children, 8-year-old Miguel Garcia, reminded him of his nephew Tommy. For 15 years, he had continued investigating on his own time, maintaining files and following every possible lead. When Tommy began having his mysterious reactions to Margaret Wilson, Detective Santos initially dismissed it as childhood anxiety, but as the behavior persisted and became more intense, he began to pay closer attention. The breakthrough came when Detective Santos was visiting his sister's family for Tommy's 7th birthday party. As they were setting up decorations in the backyard, Tommy suddenly became agitated, pointing toward Margaret's house and saying, "She's going to water the plants. She's going to water the plants." It was 3 p.m., not Margaret's usual watering time, but sure enough, moments later, Margaret emerged with her garden hose to water her flower beds. Detective Santos watched his nephew's reaction with growing concern. The child wasn't just afraid, he was exhibiting signs of genuine trauma. The way Tommy's breathing became rapid and shallow, the way his hands shook, the way he seemed to dissociate from his surroundings. These were symptoms Santos had seen in adult witnesses who had experienced severe psychological trauma. That night, Santos called his contact at the FBI and described Tommy's behavior. Agent Rebecca Martinez, who had worked on the witness protection disappearances, was immediately interested. "Lou, I want you to think about this carefully," Agent Martinez said. "Your nephew's behavior. When did it start exactly?" "About 2 years ago, when the Wilson woman moved in next door." "And you said the child reacts specifically to her watering her lawn." "Every morning at 7:30, like clockwork." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Lou, I need you to get me everything you can on Margaret Wilson. Address, background, when she moved in, how she paid for the house, everything." "Rebecca, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that after 15 years, we might finally have a lead." Within 48 hours, FBI agents were conducting surveillance on Margaret Wilson. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the Bureau's Cold Case Division. Margaret Wilson had appeared in Cedar Hills 3 years ago with a perfectly clean background that was just a little too perfect. Her teaching credentials were legitimate, but came from a small school district that had suffered a computer crash 5 years earlier, conveniently destroying most employment records. Her references were all from people who had since died or moved away. Her credit history began exactly 5 years ago. Most suspiciously, Margaret had paid $180,000 cash for her house, claiming it came from inheritance and pension savings. But there was no record of any inheritance, and the pension she claimed to receive didn't match any legitimate retirement system. Agent Martinez ran Margaret's photograph through facial recognition software and got a hit that made her blood run cold. The woman calling herself Margaret Wilson bore a striking resemblance to Catherine Mueller, a federal contract employee who had disappeared in 2010 under suspicious circumstances. Catherine Mueller had worked for a federal agency that oversaw witness protection relocations. She had access to the new identities, addresses, and background information of every family in the program, and she had vanished just 6 months after the last witness protection family had disappeared. As the FBI investigation deepened, a horrifying picture began to emerge. Catherine Mueller hadn't just disappeared. She had been systematically hunting down the families she was supposed to protect. Using her access to federal databases, Mueller had tracked each relocated family to their new homes. She had been selling their locations to the criminal organizations they had testified against, organizations that were willing to pay millions to silence witnesses who could send their members to prison. The Henderson family had been found by drug dealers they had testified against. The Garcia family had been located by human traffickers. The Patel family had been discovered by money launderers. In each case, the families had been given just enough warning to run, but not enough time to contact federal authorities or gather their belongings. What made the crimes even more chilling was Mueller's method. She would conduct surveillance on each family for weeks before making contact with their criminal enemies. She would learn their routines, their habits, their daily schedules, and she would always approach their homes early in the morning carrying something innocent-looking, often a garden hose or watering can, to avoid suspicion. Young Tommy Rodriguez wasn't reacting to Margaret Wilson's current behavior. He was reacting to suppressed memories of Catherine Mueller approaching his family's previous home in Cleveland, carrying a garden hose just hours before armed men forced them to flee in the middle of the night. Tommy Rodriguez wasn't just afraid of his neighbor. He was the only surviving witness to one of the most systematic betrayals in federal law enforcement history. On a quiet Tuesday morning, as Margaret Wilson emerged at exactly 7:30 a.m. to water her lawn, she found Agent Rebecca Martinez and a team of FBI agents waiting for her. "Catherine Mueller," Agent Martinez said, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, violation of federal witness protection protocols, and accessory to 15 counts of kidnapping." Margaret, Catherine, didn't try to run. She didn't claim innocence. She simply dropped her garden hose and said, "I was wondering when you'd finally figure it out." As she was handcuffed and led to a federal vehicle, the neighborhood watched in shock. Margaret Wilson, the quiet teacher who baked cookies for newcomers and volunteered at the library, was actually one of the most wanted fugitives in federal law enforcement. The arrest of Catherine Mueller solved a 15-year-old mystery, but it opened fresh wounds for the families who had lost everything because of her betrayal. Of the 3 families she had betrayed, only fragments remained. Tommy Rodriguez, formerly Miguel Garcia, whose parents had been killed but who had survived. Elena Henderson, who had been found living under another identity in Canada, and Dr. Rajesh Patel, who had spent 15 years believing his wife and children were dead. Tommy's recovery was slow but steady. With the help of trauma counselors and the knowledge that the source of his fear was no longer a threat, he began to process the memories he had suppressed. His parents, Maria and Carlos Rodriguez, learned the truth about their adopted son's background and committed to helping him heal from his experiences. Detective Luis Santos was commended for his persistence in keeping the cold case active, and his observations about his nephew's behavior were credited with finally solving the mystery. Agent Rebecca Martinez led a task force that used Mueller's information to locate and rescue several other missing witnesses who had been living in hiding. Catherine Mueller was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. At her sentencing, she showed no remorse for her actions, stating only that she had been providing a service to people who needed information. The neighborhood of Maple Street struggled to come to terms with the revelation that they had been living next door to a fugitive for 3 years. Some residents expressed guilt for having suspected that something was wrong with Tommy's behavior, while others felt betrayed by how thoroughly they had been deceived. Tommy Rodriguez, now understanding the source of his fears, gradually began to heal. With therapy and the support of his adoptive family, he learned to separate his traumatic memories from his current safe environment. The morning routine that had terrorized him for 2 years, 7:30 a.m., the sound of a garden hose, the sight of someone watering their lawn, slowly became just another part of neighborhood life. Dr. Rajesh Patel was reunited with his surviving daughter, Elena Henderson, and they began the long process of rebuilding their family relationships. The criminal organizations that had paid Catherine Mueller for information were systematically investigated and prosecuted, bringing justice for crimes that had remained unsolved for 15 years. The case became a landmark in federal law enforcement, leading to complete overhauls of witness protection security protocols and background checks for all personnel with access to protected witness information. 2 years after Catherine Mueller's arrest, Maple Street had returned to its quiet suburban rhythm. A new neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, moved into 1247 Maple Street. She was a retired librarian who also enjoyed gardening, but she wisely chose to water her lawn in the afternoons. Tommy Rodriguez, now 9 years old, had grown into a confident, happy child who excelled in school and played on the neighborhood soccer team. He still saw a counselor occasionally, but his traumatic memories no longer controlled his daily life. On the anniversary of Mueller's arrest, Tommy stood in his front yard with his parents and watched Mrs. Patterson tend to her garden. For the first time in years, the sight of a neighbor with a garden hose didn't fill him with terror. "I'm okay now," he told his parents. "She's not the scary lady. The scary lady is gone forever." Detective Luis Santos kept a photo from the case on his desk, not of Catherine Mueller, but of Tommy Rodriguez smiling at his 9th birthday party. It reminded him that sometimes the most important witnesses are the ones who can't yet speak for themselves, and that justice can come from the most unexpected places. The quiet neighborhood had learned that evil can hide behind the most innocent facades, but they had also learned that truth has a way of surfacing, even after years of careful concealment. And sometimes, a child's inexplicable fear is actually an inexplicable strength, the ability to recognize danger even when the adult world refuses to see it. The end. If this story showed you how intuition and persistence can solve the most complex mysteries, hit the like button and subscribe for more incredible true crime and justice stories. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had an unexplainable feeling about someone that turned out to be right?